Kevin Wacholz worked as a full-time professional wrestler from 1984 right up to 1998, having stints in World Class, the AWA, Mid-South, WWF, WCW and New Japan. Kevin should be a performer with an interesting story, a story about what it was like to work in all these main territories through the 80s and 90s. Instead, Kevin's story always comes back to his time as Nailz in the WWF and the time he attacked Vince McMahon backstage. I'm not going to say we should sit here and talk about how great his journey was in pro wrestling and how the attack was just a blip on the radar, because really, Nailz going after Vince and the lawsuits that followed really do overshadow everything Kevin did during his career as a pro wrestler. It's one of those things that simply can't be overlooked, even if it does feel unfair to Kevin himself. It's way too big of a story. Working out the details of what happened that day is seriously messy. It's another case of multiple conflicting stories or guys not wanting to divulge in exactly what happened, but I'll present some noteworthy interviews and testimonials today, and you can draw your own conclusions. This is the story of Nailz in the WWF and his altercation with Vince McMahon. Alright, let's learn more about Kevin Wacholz and let's take a look at his career before all this shit happened. Kevin was trained by Brad Rheingans, an Olympic Greco-Roman wrestler who would go on to work as a pro wrestler. Notably, he had a 4-year run with New Japan Pro Wrestling, and he was instrumental in forming the first New Japan and WCW working agreement. Kevin would debut in the AWA in March of 1984, or at least that's the first recorded date we have for Kevin, and he worked there as a babyface known as Kevin Kelly. While working in the AWA, Kevin also travelled to Portland Wrestling before arriving in Mid-South and World Class in March of 1985. In Mid-South and World Class, Kevin thought a gimmick change would be a good idea, so he wrestled as a heel and his name was Thor. Kevin, during this time in his career and during his upcoming return to the AWA, may have been considered by some as a kind of body guy. Many people would only know Kevin from his run in the WWF, and seeing as he was completely covered up in a prison uniform, some may be surprised to learn that Nailz was actually in pretty decent shape. Kevin would go back to the AWA after a WWF tryout match in the summer of 1986, and he reverted back to using his Kevin Kelly name, only this time he stayed as a heel. A pretty successful heel too that got booked pretty often. Kevin was, at one point, managed by Sherry Martel, and when Sherry left the AWA, Medusa became his manager, and Kevin would stay in the AWA right up until 1988. He would then take a year off, and in 1991, Kevin would work another few tryout matches for the World Wrestling Federation before getting signed in 1992. During that year off, Kevin's appearance changed quite a lot. It's hard to tell if he maintained the same physique, but you'd guess that he maybe didn't. The long blonde locks were gone too, and it's kinda hard to imagine that at one point this guy once called himself Thor and Mr. Magnificent. The Big Boss Man was the law, order and justice of the World Wrestling Federation. The character was inspired by Ray Traylor's previous career as a corrections officer in Cobb County, Georgia, and it was one of those gimmicks that really fit in during this era of the WWF. Videos would air on WWF TV where a former prison inmate would say he's coming to get revenge on the Big Boss Man due to his mistreatment in Cobb County, though we would never see who this inmate was or what he looked like. His voice was altered too, using a voice changer to make the voice sound way deeper than what it actually was.
You remember Boss Man? The unwritten rule here in the joint?
This inmate would speak to the Boss Man after matches, and he'd threatened to come after the Boss Man, but Ray said he'd be ready. He wasn't going to walk the streets and keep looking over his shoulder. On the May 30th, 1992 episode of Superstars, after the Boss Man got done taking care of job guy Dave Roulette, the inmate showed up, still in his prison uniform, and he viciously attacked the Boss Man in the middle of the ring. The inmate used the Boss Man's own nightstick against him. He laid in some hard knees to the head. Boss Man got handcuffed and he got his legs smacked over and over again with the nightstick. For 1992 standards, it was actually quite brutal, even though the characters and the premise of the whole thing was maybe a little over the top. The inmate was unstoppable, he was angry, the boss man had no hope at defending himself. This was all good, but then there's some weird voice dubbing going on and it does take you out of the moment.
WWF history!
Kevin's voice would be consistently altered in the WWF. When he spoke in the ring, when he spoke in promos, the WWF would make the voice deeper, and you gotta wonder if this was really necessary. Maybe Vince McMahon didn't like his voice, maybe he didn't sound intimidating enough, who knows, but have a listen yourself and you be the judge.
In SummerSlam, you're a buddy of the boss man's, and I'm gonna finish you off.
He carries the belt, and I want it. There's not too many things in life I want, but
The following week on Superstars, the beatdown was shown again, and Mean Gene Okerlund let us know that this guy answers to the name Nailz. Apparently the name was bestowed upon him by his fellow inmates. Nailz cut a pre-taped promo with his deep voice, saying that what we saw last week was the first in a long string of beatings that the boss man can expect from Nailz. The following week, we saw some images of a beaten up boss man while Mr. Perfect talked to Ray on the phone. The boss man promised to come back, and Mr. Perfect said that he hopes the boss man stays at home. Nailz wrestled the match immediately following the phone call, and poor job guy Rob Cumberledge ended up getting attacked with the nightstick. Nailz would also use a chokehold to end matches. Perfect would say it's just a chinlock with a lot of power behind it, and the beatings with the nightstick would continue. Anyone who stepped up to Nailz would usually go down, and they'd pay a hefty price after the bell had rung. The fans would chant for the boss man while Nailz destroyed his opponents, and you know, for a while it worked. It wasn't the best thing happening on WWF TV at all, and again, it was all very over the top, but the younger fans in the audience wanted boss man to come back while Nailz continued to show absolutely no redeeming qualities in terms of his character. Mean Gene Okerlund would call the boss man at home, and Ray said he had lost weight and he had been physically weakened, but he was on the road to recovery, and the boss man said that he was coming back sooner than Nailz may have anticipated. Bossman came back on the July 18th episode of Superstars, and he delivered one of the best Big Boss Man promos of his career. He said he wondered if this was all worth it. Was it worth coming back to potentially go through more trouble with Nailz and potentially end up with serious injuries that could stop him from performing in the ring, or even injuries that could end his life? Bossman said a young neighbour gave him a hug and asked if he was alright after he came back from hospital, and in that very moment he knew what he had to do. Nailz beat the Big Boss Man, but he didn't break him, and the Boss Man made a promise to his young neighbour and every man, woman and child who believes in law, order and justice that when the Big Boss Man gets his hands on Nailz, he's gonna kick his ass. Do yourself a favour and watch this one. It doesn't matter what you may think of the Big Boss Man gimmick, Ray's delivery here was absolutely fantastic. Ray did lose weight too, but he was already trimmed down by the time Nailz attacked him a few months earlier. Nailz really wasn't a hard man to find though, he was still taking out jobbers with the help of the Boss Man's nightstick. Strangely enough though, the Big Boss Man's time in the ring was kept very limited upon his return, and at the next pay-per-view, Nailz would face Virgil and not Ray Trailer. On the house shows, Bossman vs Nailz was already happening, but for whatever reason, the match was delayed on WWF television. Maybe Vince thought Bossman wasn't ready for a big match on TV yet, or maybe they just wanted to stretch things out a little. At SummerSlam in Wembley Stadium, Nailz destroyed Virgil. Big Boss Man did not make the trip to London, so there was no one there to stop the attack. Bossman would start making more regular in-ring appearances on TV, and Nailz would continue to destroy job guys. It felt a little odd that the Bossman said he was coming after Nailz, yet nothing would happen for weeks upon weeks, even though both guys were on the same shows in different matches. It did start to feel like the WWF were dragging things out a little. Nailz would do the exact same thing for weeks and weeks. It actually ended up being Nailz who called the Bossman out on the 10th of October episode of Superstars.
Get out here right now!
Nailz would do the same thing a few weeks later. He'd call out the Bossman, but instead of the Bossman coming out to get his revenge, the Undertaker showed up instead. The Undertaker vs Nailz was supposed to be the next feud that Nailz would take part in, and the two were even featured on the cover of a WWF magazine, but the feud wouldn't properly get off the ground. More on that later. The Big Boss Man vs Nailz was made official for Survivor Series 1992, and their match would feature a nightstick on a pole. Grab the nightstick, use it as much as you want, and pin your opponent. Bossman said he was going to do society a favour at Survivor Series. There'd be no chance for parole, no chance for a pardon. The Big Boss Man was going to beat Nailz within an inch of his life, and Nailz would serve some hard time following the match at Survivor Series. How did Nailz answer this promo? By beating up a jobber the exact same way he'd beaten every other jobber in his WWF career. We get to the pay-per-view, and the Big Boss Man vs Nailz is the second match on the card. Before the bout, Nailz said he was put in jail for something he didn't do. Nailz was innocent, and he's gonna take out his frustrations on the Big Boss Man tonight, and he's gonna finish what he started back in May. The Big Boss Man said he saw the police report, and Nailz is certainly not innocent. We never did find out exactly what Nailz was convicted of, but Bossman knows that Nailz deserved his sentence. The Big Boss Man is out to get revenge tonight, and he's also gonna do his job. He's gonna make sure Nailz serves hard time inside the ring. The nightstick match wasn't great, to be honest. When you watch Mr. Magnificent Kevin Kelly matches, and then you watch Nailz matches, it's like watching two completely different performers. And I know the gimmicks were very different, but Kevin didn't move around the ring the same way he once did. He was never what you'd call a great in-ring performer, but he was definitely better in the AWA. This Survivor Series match was really the first time he had to bump around the ring for someone, and it wasn't good. It's only a 5.5 minute match, but that's about 3 minutes too long, and Nailz was absolutely blown up when it was all over. Bossman retrieved the nightstick. Nailz took a few shots before grabbing the nightstick himself, but we end up seeing the Bossman slam, and it's all over. Nailz would make one more in-ring television appearance, a match against Mike Collins on the 12th of December 1992 episode of Superstars, but keep in mind this match was taped before the Survivor Series show. The WWF booked a few Undertaker vs Nailz matches at house shows to get the men prepared for their eventual TV bouts, with one of these matches taking place at Madison Square Garden. Nailz would also wrestle Jim Duggan a few times, and on the 13th of December 1992, the day after his final WWF match was televised, Nailz wrestled a house show match against the Big Boss Man in Moline, Illinois. It's been reported that Nailz was unhappy about his pay. It was either in regards to the Big Boss Man match, or he was unhappy with his pay regarding the Madison Square Garden bout. Either way, he was annoyed, and he travelled to the next arena with the intention of confronting Vince McMahon. The story that's been widely reported is that Nailz went into Vince McMahon's office, he grabbed him by the throat while threatening to beat the shit out of him. This wasn't a shitty chinlock either, by the way. Apparently Kevin had his hands wrapped tight around Vince McMahon's neck. Agents and wrestlers had to pull Nailz away from Vince, and Nailz was immediately fired. Now, the Berserker, real name John Nord, said he was travelling with Kevin that day to the arena, and Kevin had asked John to sit outside Vince's office while Kevin went in. Berserker also said that Kevin definitely intended to hurt Vince McMahon. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. Charlie Norris, who people may remember from WCW, was also travelling with Kevin and John that day, and what he said pretty much matches up with what the Berserker said. During an interview with the Two-Man Power Trip of Wrestling podcast, Charlie said, "Nailz was working a program with the Big Boss Man. They did Madison Square Garden, where you're supposed to get a nice little chunk of money there from that, not just the money you're getting. We were going over there, me, John Nord, and Nailz that day. I didn't believe him, but he said, I'm going to choke out Vince, I'm going to get Vince tonight, and you guys pretend you're pulling me off of him, but not really. Just make an effort because I don't want you guys to get in trouble." So me and Nord were in there. I don't see how we could have pulled him off anyway. I don't think 50 people could have pulled him off. He was one bad dude. Nice guy, great guy, and I loved his gimmick. But he asked Vince, how come my payoff is so low? It was ridiculous, like $600 for Madison Square Garden. So he asked Vince, and Vince got snotty with him. He did grab Vince and he was really choking him. He let him go, but yeah, this was in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We were watching the door so nobody else could get in there. John Nord, me, and I don't remember who else was there. He got fired after that. Judging by the match records, the only thing that doesn't match up here is the fact that Nailz wrestled The Undertaker at Madison Square Garden and not the Boss Man. and this means there could be confusion over the match and the venue in question, but what we do know is that this all started over a low payday for Nailz. Nailz thought he should have been paid more. Even the Wrestling Observer claimed it was due to the SummerSlam 1992 payoff, and Mean Gene Okerlund recalled it being the Survivor Series payoff, but it doesn't really matter which event it was. Gene Okerlund said that Nailz was paid $8,000, whereas his opponent was paid $25,000 for the night in question. Loads of conflicting accounts here. The Berserker more or less told the same story as Charlie Norris, but he added something else. Nord said, and you can check this yourself online by the way, but Nord said Nailz specifically told him that he was going to make allegations against Vince McMahon while in the office. He was going to say that Vince had tried to make a move on him and he touched him inappropriately. Nailz would phone the cops immediately following the altercation, accusing Vince of being extremely indecent, and Nailz would use this as an excuse for attacking Vince when all along it was all over money. Now, please keep in mind that this is what's gathered by reading second and third hand accounts. Someone might come out with a story next week that contradicts everything. Someone might have already contradicted everything in another interview. But this is the story that matches up with the most accounts, and therefore it's the one that most people go with. Bret Hart said he was in the corridor when the altercation happened, and Bret wrote in his book, Kevin cornered Vince in his office and screamed at him for 15 minutes about all the lies he'd been told. His yelling got so loud I had goosebumps up my back as I listened from down the hall. Suddenly there was a loud crash. Nailz had knocked Vince over in his chair, choking him violently, until Lanza, Slaughter and a swarm of agents teamed up to pull him off. Nailz walked out and immediately called the police and accused Vince of making advances to him, and Vince was charged. The charges were dropped shortly thereafter. Some of the boys actually admired Nailz for snatching Vince and then covering his tracks well enough not to get charged himself. The last thing Vince wanted was yet another scandal. Bret elaborated on this too during an interview with Kayfabe Commentaries, where he said Nailz was shrieking like a hysterical woman, and Bret also said he heard a gurgling sound. Hart said he was about to open the door, but then he decided against it. But Lanza yelled at Bret to come and help when everyone else was trying to pull Kevin away from Vince. Bret said the police showed up, Vince was charged, and Nailz went home. Bret also said McMahon was choked pretty hard too. Kevin was all in with this attack, and the hitman said things could have been really bad if the agents didn't intervene. On his podcast, Bruce Pritchard said everything happened so fast, it was a blur. It was crazy, but you just put your head down and you move on. He also said that most things that were printed about the incident and most things that were said in interviews were not true, even though a ton of stories definitely match up. In reality though, there was no moving on, at least immediately. The police report was filed 2 days later and it contained those allegations against McMahon, while the WWF statement on the issue alleged that Kevin was trying to extort $150,000 from Vince McMahon. In the end, all charges were dropped on both sides, and of course Nailz didn't work for the WWF ever again. Nailz did get another chance though. He testified against McMahon during the steroid trial. He said in court that he hated Vince McMahon's guts, and he was the only wrestler who claimed McMahon had pressured him into artificially enhancing his body. Kevin's claims didn't hold much merit though. Vince's defense said that Kevin was a hostile witness who was disgruntled over being fired, and his claims were only made as a way of getting revenge. The New York Times ran a story on Kevin's testimony, and the newspaper article said, Mr. Wacholz claimed that during a conversation in January of 1992, Mr. McMahon told him at £300 he was still not big enough to portray the Nailz character. Mr. Wacholz testified that he told Mr. McMahon he'd been working out regularly but not taking steroids, and that Mr. McMahon responded, "You should be. I strongly suggest you go on the gas," he said Mr. McMahon told him. So, did all this stop WCW from hiring Nailz? Of course not. Kevin had one match in WCW a year later, but it was a pretty big one, a singles match against Sting at Slamboree 1993. Nailz looked the exact same, but now he was known as the Prisoner. He still carried the nightstick as the audience at Slamboree chanted "Boss Man" during his entrance, and he was billed from Green Bay, Wisconsin, the city where the Vince McMahon incident happened. The Sting match was absolutely awful, by the way. Many consider it one of Sting's worst pay-per-view matches. Slamboree 1993 was a one-and-done deal, but Kevin would show up again in WCW in 1997, although he was kept off TV. He had a dark match against Yuji Nagata on Nitro, and he wrestled Barry Darsow at a WCW house show the year later. In between these WCW dates, Nailz could be found working independent shows across America, and he even went on a New Japan tour in 1994, so it doesn't look like the incident made him less attractive to big promotions, although he definitely worked less. Still, it's quite noteworthy that WCW would take Kevin on with all the bad publicity that followed him. It was reported too that he was paid around $150,000 in WCW during his later stint in the company. That's a lot of money for someone who wasn't being used. Bischoff defended this by saying this was the entry rate for someone with a bit of experience. 75 grand would be suitable for someone working in the power plant. Bischoff also said he didn't hire Kevin because of the Vince McMahon incident. Bischoff and Kevin go way back to the AWA. And Eric said there was a role for a guy like Kevin in WCW, but in 1997 and 1998, I really struggled to see what that role could be. And that's the story of Nailz and the World Wrestling Federation, and what a story it was. He had his last match in 2001 and now he's officially retired. It was reported that he now leads a secluded life. He worked as a trailer salesman in Bloomington, Minnesota, and he currently resides in Minneapolis with his family. I'm surprised he hasn't been featured in shoot interviews and things of that nature, because I'm sure many people would want to hear his side of the story in regards to exactly what happened, but we also know that he might not be 100% truthful. Still, it would be interesting to watch. That'll do it for today's video then. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.
If you ever